In 21st century America, we are so rarely thirsty. In fact, if you've ever gone without something to drink for a day, or you've been stranded without water, most likely, if that's ever happened, you'll always remember that event. For me, many years ago when we lived back in California, I'll never forget a day that a friend of mine and I, we rented a couple of four-wheelers and we went out into the desert east of San Diego. And at the four-wheeler rental facility, this guy gave us a map. It was actually hand-drawn in Xerox, so I should have known in that moment it was gonna be a pretty rough day. When looking at this hand-drawn map and trying to get a lay of the land and the landmarks, I see what looks to be a bombshell in the upper left-hand corner. And I asked the guy, "What's with the bombshell?" And he says, "Yeah, you don't want to go anywhere near there. That's actually an active military training ground where they test artillery shells. So don't go on that portion of the map." Okay, great. We'll avoid that portion. So we set out on our four-wheelers, our great little map in hand, and we go and navigate and play in the sand dunes and have lots of fun. But at one point, a sandstorm kicks up. And it gets so windy and the sand is so blinding, we lose all direction of where we're going. We had no service, so the compass on our phone doesn't help us at all. All we have is our hand-drawn map, and we get lost for hours. We luckily avoid the bombing location, though we saw the signs that we didn't cross to enter that area. But once we finally made it back to the facility where we rented those four-wheelers, I'll never forget having been stranded out in the desert for hours, the thirst I felt, because of course, being a couple of men, we forgot to take water with us. I'm apparently not very outdoorsy. So we run back into our car and we down just like a gallon of water that was waiting for us in the car. I'll never forget the deep thirst I felt. What I love about Jesus is he finds a very real need in someone's life. The woman at the well is where we're going to be reading John chapter 4 today. He finds this woman's thirst, this physical need she has, and he actually digs deeper to a very real spiritual need that she possesses, and a need that we all have. That need is that we're all thirsty. Let's pick up in John chapter 4, starting in verse number 7. A woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" For Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. Now, before we go any further, I want to just speak briefly to that idea of why a Jewish rabbi would have no dealings with a Samaritan woman. If you go back into the pages of Israel's history, you can find it in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Israel was at one point a united kingdom, but after King Solomon, there was argument between the tribes of who would succeed Solomon's throne. And basically the kingdom split into two kingdoms, the northern and the southern kingdom. Samaria became the capital of the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem the capital of the southern kingdom, or Judah as it would be known. And because of foreign oppression and battles from other kingdoms, Assyria would come in and conquer the northern kingdom and would exile a lot of the northern kingdom, but it would also bring in and settle with their own people. And the Assyrians basically intermarried with the northern kingdom and brought in their culture and their worship of foreign gods. So if you fast forward to Jesus' day, the Jews from Jerusalem and the surrounding area of the southern kingdom, they would have viewed Samaritans, first of all, as like the northerners who didn't really belong in the true Israel, but worse, they were kind of viewed as half-blood Jews because they had mixed and married with other nations, other lands, and had adopted their gods. Jews did not like Samaritans. They were like the exact opposite. They were the worst case scenario to the people of Israel in the first century. So it's not just that Jesus was talking to a woman, which was interesting in and of itself, but this woman represented all that was wrong with Israel's history. And yet Jesus, this Jewish rabbi, sits down. He doesn't see these dividing lines as walls that he can't permeate. In fact, he breaks right through it in order to bring the good news of what he has to offer, salvation, even to the Samaritans. Let's continue as we read on in verse 10. Jesus answered her, "If you know the gift of God and who it is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to her, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." Now, something that we know from the very first verses of John chapter 4 is that this woman was by herself and goes to the well at midday, at high noon, in fact, to draw water. Now, in this culture, women would never go to the well by themselves. Usually they'd go in groups to draw water. It would almost be like a social event of their day, an opportunity to reconnect and to go into community. And they would never go at high noon in the middle of a hot desert, myself in the middle of the desert on the four-wheeler that day. The sun would have beaten down, the wind would have been whipping, it would have been overbearing and hot. And yet this woman goes in midday. We're gonna find out why in just a moment. What we're gonna find out is that this woman is thirsty, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. And I think it's much like you and I. We're all thirsty. We're all seeking for something that ultimately will not satisfy. And Jesus says, stop digging a well, stop going to a well, and instead find a source of water that's eternal. It's bubbling up within. It's like a spring versus a well. Now let's continue and see how Jesus answers this woman. In verse 16, Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you've had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." And then in verse 20 and on, she kind of skips the conversation. She deflects into a theological debate that Samaritans and Jews would have argued in that day of, where do we go to worship? Do we have to go into Jerusalem like you Jews say? She's trying to deflect the deeper conversation. Essentially, she wants to stay on the surface. Picture the imagery here. She wants to stay on the surface and lower her bucket down into a well and find that source of water down somewhere deeper, but she doesn't want to have to do the digging herself. And Jesus is going to cut right to the heart of the matter. That's why he opens by saying, "Go and get your husband." He knows she has no husband, and he knows that she's had 5 husbands in the past, and she's living with a man now who's not her husband. I think so often we look at this woman and we judge her, but most likely in the first century, it's possible some of those men may have died and she mourned their losses. But what most likely happened is women couldn't divorce a man according to law in that day. Only a man could serve divorce papers, and so most likely she was left and oppressed and marginalized by multiple men. She was put into a position where she had to try to provide for herself and maybe children. She was abandoned, she was hurting, and she was likely searching for a source of life. That's why she shied away from community. She hid herself in broad daylight and went to the well by herself. And Jesus cuts to the heart and says, "You're thirsty, but you don't realize what you're thirsty for." I think of how so often in our culture we run from thing to thing, from opportunity to promotion, to pouring ourselves into making a name for ourselves and work, to focusing on social media like likes and shares and making sure that our name is made great. We project this image of ourselves and we hope and pray that people will accept us, that they'll like us, and that we'll be good enough. I look around at our world and I see a lot of us digging wells. Think of all of the effort in a dry, desertous region that Jacob and his men would have gone to in order to dig that very well that they stood at that day. It would have been through blood, sweat, and toil that they dug probably hundreds of feet down to find a source of water. And yet Jesus says, if you could just ask me, I'd give you this eternal bubbling spring that comes up. It waters and nurtures and gives life to your very soul. We are so thirsty. We're so busy running from source of water to source of water that doesn't quench our thirst. And Jesus says, I have what you're looking for right here. I love you. I've accepted you. I have grace for you. And I have a better way of living for you. That's why in verse 28 we read this. So the woman left her water jar and went away into town and said to the people, the very people she had been avoiding by going to the well at midday, she goes to them, she runs to them, and she says, "Come and see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?" And they went out of the town and were coming to him. I love the imagery here because this woman comes to the well meticulously at midday in order to avoid the community, avoid the scandal, and she not only feels so filled up by this encounter with Jesus that she runs back into those very same people and radiates the love of Jesus and tells them, look, come and meet this man who told me everything I've ever done wrong. Can he be the Messiah? But she also leaves her water jar by the well. The very reason she went to the well that day didn't even matter because her thirst was finally satisfied. She was satisfied because she's found the source of eternal life. Just a few verses earlier, Jesus says, I am that Messiah that you're looking for. The one who might come and answer this great theological debate between Jews and Samaritans, I am he. And so Jesus tells her, I've got the source of eternal life. I've got this well, this spring that can bubble up in your life, and it will satisfy and it'll quench your thirst. I love how the results of that woman going back into the town are that the people, on hearing her testimony, they go out and they meet Jesus. Again, these are Samaritans. They go meet a Jewish rabbi because they have to hear for themselves, like, what has this man done in her life? We know this woman, we know her history, we know her story, and yet there's a man who's given her something more. We have to go experience it. My friends, I think we're so thirsty in life, and we're running to all kinds of things that won't satisfy. We all have our hang-ups and our issues, and yet we think that going to those hang-ups will somehow quench an emotional or spiritual need crying out within our soul. But the truth is, only Jesus offers this eternal, bubbling spring that leads to eternal life. The question is, are we willing to go in deep? Are we willing to go to the man who tells us everything we've ever done wrong and still shows us love and grace? And I think the result is pretty evident, that we'd be willing to go and tell the world that this man knows our sin and yet loves us and forgives us and gives us new eternal life.